Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and in this lecture we're going to learn about the Puritan New World, a forgotten war, the two sons of Thanksgiving, problems, like so many problems, a murder mystery, and a countdown to violence. We're going to follow that outline right up there as we learn all about Puritans and problems in the New World of America. Now, this New World was created in the winter of 1620 and 1621, and with the alliance of the Puritans in Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag of New England. And this was cemented in the first Thanksgiving of 1621. And all of the characters were there. We've got William Bradford, governor of the Plymouth Colony. We've got Massasoit, the king of the Wampanoag Nation. We've got their intermediary, Squanto. And the friendships formed at this first Thanksgiving will create 2 generations of peace. And the success of Plymouth Colony essentially unlocks New England to waves of subsequent English migration. And the English are coming. Because remember, there were 2 types of Puritans. You had the Reformers and the Separatists. The Reformers wanted to fix old England. The Separatists wanted to build a new England. And by 1660, the Reformers are done. They are over. Because the Reformers fought the English Civil War. They won the English Civil War. They built Puritan England. And Puritan England failed. And it failed spectacularly. And even the army they built to defend Puritan England ends up switching sides and backs the Restoration of 1660. And when King Charles II becomes the new King of England, and one of the things Charles II does is basically dismantle Puritan England. And the Puritans hate Charles so much. They hate Charles so much. They hate Charles not just because he dismantles Puritan England. They hate Charles not just because he allows things like Christmas and public drinking and dancing and women in the theater. They just hate Charles so much because he's everything a Puritan isn't. He barely goes to church. He doesn't read his Bible. He wears colors. He doesn't like John Calvin. He doesn't believe in predestination. He sleeps with dozens and dozens and dozens of women and a couple men. He's good time Charlie. He's good time Charlie, and the Puritans hate everything about good time Charlie. But what they really hate about good time Charlie, is King Charles II is successful. In fact, he goes down in history as one of the best kings England ever had. He's calm, he's patient, he doesn't get ruffled. He gets drunk a lot and sleeps around, but he's pretty much content to let the country run itself. And he chooses very, very wise advisors because he really actually doesn't want to do any work. Good time Charlie, Puritans absolutely hate him. Oh my God, they hate him so much. Now, while Puritan England might have failed, the Puritans still have New England. And with their Wampanoag allies, the English Puritans flood across the Atlantic and establish all of these different colonies across New England. They build a new world. They build a Puritan New World. And this is the world that they build, okay? This is southern New England by the time we get to the mid to late 17th century. We have a number of Puritan colonies mixed in and among a series of Native American nations. And it's a really, really unusual landscape. So let's actually look at what the Puritan New World actually looks like. We have Puritan New England itself. It's more or less made up of 5 separate colonies. You, of course, have the original colony of Plymouth, which is there. You have the largest and most powerful, the wealthiest of the Puritan New England colonies, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is there, which is centered at the great city of Boston, which they are rapidly building and is growing extremely fast. Now, you've got a third Protestant colony in the north. You've got New Hampshire, which is centered on the town of Exeter, which is there. And then in the south, you have a pair of Puritan colonies in the south, the Connecticut colony and the New Haven colony. Now, both Connecticut and New Haven aren't very large colonies, and in 1664, they actually joined together. So the New Haven colony becomes part of the Connecticut colony. Now, The thing is that these colonies are scattered across southern New England, but they're not alone. They are mixed in and among these Native American nations because, of course, the Native Americans are still there. We have the largest and most powerful of these Native American nations, the Wampanoag Nation. With their English allies, they have rapidly become the ascendant Indian nation in New England. They are large, they are powerful, they are wealthy, they are very well respected, and they have very strong allies in Puritan New England. They completely overshadow their old rivals, the Narragansetts, who used to be the strongest Native American nation in New England. The Narragansetts very much live in the shadow of the Wampanoags. And the Narragansetts have a group of allies, these kind of crazy little pirate allies who live on the coast. They're called the Pequod. And the Pequod play a very, very key role in what we're about to discuss. And to the west, there is the third most powerful Native American nation, the Mohegans, who live on the other side of the Connecticut colony. Now, here's the thing you need to remember about southern New England. This is a completely mixed landscape. It is a complete mixture of colonial English and Native American settlements. Everything is just mixed together. You'll have a Puritan town, and not even half a day's walk away, you'll have 2 Indian villages. You'll have an English farm out in the forest, and his nearest neighbors might just be a pair of other Native American farmers, and he's got to walk a day to get to an Indian village, and then 2 days to get to an English town. Everything is mixed together. This is key. There is no clear frontier. In fact, there's no frontier at all. There's no line on a map with on one side you have Native Americans and on the other side you have English colonists. There's nothing like that. Everything is mixed together. All of these people know each other. If you are living in southern New England in the 17th century, your neighbor is just as likely to be a Narragansett or a Wampanoag than it is to be a Puritan colonist from New England. And what makes this mixed landscape, this kind of landscape of neighbors and friends, what enables this landscape to succeed are the friendships that come from that first Thanksgiving. The friendships that were created in 1621 last the rest of these men's lives. William Bradford becomes really good friends with Massasoit, and Massasoit is really good friends with William Bradford. And people remark on the friendship between these two men. If there's a problem with the Puritans, William Bradford will just go, look, I'm just going to go talk to Massasoit about this. And he'll go to a place called Mount Hope, which is where Massasoit lives. And he'll sit down with Massasoit, they'll smoke a peace pipe, and at the end of a long conversation, and maybe after a meal, William Bradford will say, okay, we've got this problem. These guys are missing some cattle. They think some Wampanoags might have killed their cattle. And Massasoit will puff on his pipe and say, yeah, I heard about the same thing. Okay, let's fix this. And they will literally fix it. And the opposite holds true. Some Wampanoag will complain to Massasoit about they're having problems with the English colonists. Massasoit will kind of scratch his head and say, let me go talk to William about this. And then, like this in the illustration right up above, Massasoit will go to William Bradford. They will sit on the floor together, so no person is looking over anyone else. And they'll pass the pipe back and forth. They'll have a drink or two. And then Massasoit will say, look, William, I had a problem. These Wampanoags think they got cheated out of some land. And William Bradford will puff on Massasoit's pipe and go, yeah, I heard about this. Okay, let's fix this. And they will literally fix the problem between them. It is a truly remarkable friendship, and it creates, 50 years of peace in New England. And it creates this strong union between the Wampanoag Nation and the English settlers in New England, particularly with the Plymouth colony. But that alliance is based on the friendship between these two men. And no one lives forever. William Bradford dies in 1657. There is his gravesite. I got tired of using that bad illustration of William Bradford, so I used a still from a National Geographic series called Saints and Strangers. So I'm using sexy William Bradford right up above me. His eyeshadow game is on point. So there's sexy William Bradford. William Bradford dies in 1657. They have a funeral for him. There is his grave. You can visit his grave in New England today. Massasoit attends his friend's funeral. Everyone is very sad. They elect a series of new governors. And the new governors, in particular, a guy called Hosea Winslow, these new governors are not the men, not the kind of man that William Bradford was. They're smaller, they're pettier, they're much more narrow-minded. Massasoit himself probably dies around 1660. I really like this image of Massasoit. He's got the wolf skin over one shoulder. Massasoit dies around 1660. He dies at Mount Hope. There is his grave. There's a funeral. A lot of sort of Puritans go to the funeral of King Massasoit. They're very sad, but these guys are old men, all right? They are no longer running the colony. And with the death of William Bradford and with the death of Massasoit, that friendship is gone. And their successors are not the same quality of individual that William Bradford and Massasoit were. And the end of the friendship, the end of these friendships results in terrible, terrible things. In fact, it results in King Philip's War. King Philip's War is awful. King Philip's War is bad. King Philip's War is like as bad as it gets. And one of the more remarkable things about King Philip's War is that it didn't even really last that long. The major fighting erupts in June of 1675, and the last big battles are done with by August of 1676. It's not really that long. It's this incredible amount of violence that's just compressed into a short amount of time. The whole war, doesn't even last a year and a half. But even though the major fighting is done with by 1676, there are still kind of armed bands out in the forests of New England fighting in the name of King Philip for decades afterwards. There are Indians in the forests of New Hampshire, and especially the Wabanaki Nation fights on in central and northern Maine well into the 18th century. The last combatants don't really lay down their arms until around 1720, 45 years after, King Philip launched his great war against Puritan New England. And King Philip's War is probably one of the most important military conflicts in American history. And what makes this even stranger is that it's almost completely forgotten. I mean, you've got the big wars of American history. Everybody knows about these. You've got the Revolution, the Civil War, World War II, World War I. But, King Philip's War is right in there among them. It more or less sets the stage for subsequent American history and establishes certain trends that are going to continue for centuries after the last fighting has stopped at Mount Hope. King Philip's War is probably the most important, most forgotten military conflict in American history. First off, let's actually look at sort of the characteristics of King Philip's War. It is the first major American military conflict. King Philip's War is the first official American war, all right? Now, yeah, you've got fighting down in Virginia, and you had kind of the tit for tat back and forth between the Virginia colony and the Powhatan Confederacy. But those are just like small groups of people fighting. Those aren't large military groups moving across the landscape and engaging in formal military battles, in actual battles. You have this with King Philip's War. You have armies, you have encounters, you have logistics, you've got supply. King Philip's War is the first really major war in American history. And to this day, King Philip's War remains the single most destructive war in American history. If you talk about proportions, not in terms of total numbers, but in terms of proportions, almost half of all the English towns are attacked. And more than a third of them are burned down. It is a terribly destructive war. Boston itself is attacked. They attacked the outskirts of Boston. It is in terms of proportion, it is the most destructive war in American history. There's more things get devastated. It fundamentally changes the political and economic situation in New England. It is also the deadliest war in American history, certainly in terms of a proportion of the population. Almost somewhere between 8 and 10% of all American colonists are killed in King Philip's War. This is death. This isn't wounding. These aren't casualties. This isn't maiming. This is just straight up dead. It kills around 8% of the entire population of Puritan New England. And that's just the English colonies. If we count the Native Americans, you know, the casualties are enormous. In fact, you can only estimate how many Native Americans die in King Philip's War. Basically, in a single, year and a half, the entire population of New England drops by a fifth. And some estimates say that the entire population of New England dropped by a quarter, between June of 1675 and August of 1676. 1 in 5, 1 in 4 people living in New England is dead at the end of this. It's absolutely a devastating war. It's the most destructive war in American history. Proportionally, it's the deadliest war in American history. And the outcome of King Philip's War sets the policy between the English colonists and later the United States of America and the Native Americans. It will set and determine American Indian policy for the next 250 years. As long as there is a frontier, the institutions and the trends established during King Philip's War set Native American policy, until the 20th century. It's an incredibly influential war that is almost completely forgotten. Now, as we study King Philip's War, the lead up to the war, the conduct of the war, and what happens after the war, we are, of course, going to answer a historical debate. You are going to be given all the tools, all the puzzle pieces to answer that question right there. So put that question in your notes and have this question percolating through your brain as we proceed through the lecture. And the question is, who won King Philip's War? What was King Philip's War? Describe and summarize the events of the conflict. Who fought it and why did they fight it? Who lost it? And finally, how did it end and why is it important? So let's go back to Puritan England in the 1620s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. You've got a lot of English Puritans who are fleeing from the dismantling of Puritan England, from the restoration of 1660 and King Charles. Oh, they hate him so much. And they are flooding into this Puritan New England. Now, I've talked about all these different Puritan colonies, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New Haven. And I make it seem like all of these colonies are getting along and everything is nice and well and they're building this wonderful Puritan New England. And that's not really what the situation was. One of the things the Puritans discover really quickly when they transport themselves to the New World is that there is a lot of conflict going on. There's a lot of economic competition, political competition, a lot of religious argument, because Puritan New England was not a unified group of colonies, but rather it's a group of scattered Puritan settlements racked with rivalry, racked with jealousy, religious dissent, economic competition, and political difference. And I'll talk about a few of these problems that are facing Puritan New England, one of which is religious dissent. One of the things the Puritans figure out really quickly is that if you do not have an ecclesiastical authority, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, if you get rid of all of that, and they got rid of it, one of the things you run into really quickly is that there is no institution that can establish any kind of religious orthodoxy. And when you get rid of a religious hierarchy, anybody can have religious services in their house and no one can agree what is exactly correct worship. So you have a lot of religious dissent. Can women be preachers? What kind of lessons should be preached? How do you reconcile, different interpretations of the Bible? All of these things just rack Puritan New England. And because they're trying to build the community of the elect, these are serious, serious discussions. You can't just let everybody just kind of willy-nilly worship the way they want, because if you do that, you're going to invite divine punishment. And one of the things that happens is that there's so much religious argument and there's so much religious dissent that a large percentage of the Puritans of New England kind of just nope out of religion entirely. People, church attendance starts to decline. church fervor starts to decline. People don't want to go to church. And here, like 3 pastors start arguing over like what a passage in the Bible means. People don't like that, okay? So there is a lot of religious dissent in these colonies. I mean, this is, John Winthrop very famously, expels, a very pregnant Anne Hutchinson is kicked out of Massachusetts Bay Colony for, not preaching Puritan orthodoxy, not teaching Puritan orthodoxy. And then there's the issue of a group of people we're going to meet called praying Indians. Can you proselytize to the Native Americans? Some group of Puritans say, yes, they're people, they are the children of God. We need to bring the light of Jesus to these people. Other Puritans are like, no, they're obviously not members of the elect. So why would we even bother? And if they are a member of the elect, then they will be automatically filled with the Spirit of God and they will come to us. All right. So you've got kind of 2 different schools about if you should proselytize to the Native Americans. But people do end up going and proselytizing to the Native Americans, and a large number of Native Americans convert, to the Puritan church. They convert to the teachings of John Calvin. And these people are known as praying Indians. And the praying Indians are going to cause problems. And I'm going to talk about the real problems caused by the political problems caused by the praying Indians in just a tick. Another problem is the failure to cooperate. England gets in various wars with like the Dutch and the French, and the colonies of New England say, we really should kind of unify, in case we're attacked by another European power. So this political organization is proposed called the United Colonies of New England. And it is a complete and total failure. These colonies cannot get along. These colonies do not cooperate. And the biggest issue is that everyone is intimidated by Massachusetts Bay Colony. The growth of Boston and the growth of the great city of Boston rapidly overshadows all of these other Puritan colonies. Everyone is kind of jealous of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Everyone ends up owing money to the banks in Boston. They're not real happy. In fact, it's fear of being overshadowed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony is one of the reasons that the Connecticut and the New Haven colonies joined together. So everyone is kind of resentful and jealous of Massachusetts Bay and what John Winthrop built in Massachusetts Bay. And no one more particularly than Plymouth Colony. Plymouth Colony does not really prosper in this period, but rather Plymouth Colony is rapidly overshadowed by these other Puritan colonies. They're overshadowed by Connecticut, by New Hampshire, and they're really in the shadow of their northern neighbor, Massachusetts Bay. In fact, the colonists in Plymouth really complain quite bitterly about this because Plymouth is afraid of Massachusetts Bay. They're afraid of being absorbed, just swallowed whole by their rival to the north. And this really annoys them because they're like, we started all of this. Plymouth Colony unlocked all of New England that allows the Great Migration to come over. You guys should be grateful to us. And instead, like the rest of Puritan New England, doesn't really care about Plymouth. Plymouth is like struggling economically. They're struggling agriculturally. And they're just looking at all of this wealth and power just flow to Boston. And they watch Boston growing and growing and growing. And the shadow that Boston throws over Plymouth gets larger and larger and larger. The great fear of Plymouth Colony is just being swallowed whole by Massachusetts Bay. And this bothers them. This bothers them a lot. But the big problem is religious dissent. And the biggest religious dissenter is a guy called Roger Williams. Roger Williams is a preacher in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He starts to have a couple funny ideas about Calvinist theology. He says, look, maybe what we've been teaching about cosmic predestination isn't correct. Maybe we actually do have free will. Maybe our decisions do matter on earth and we're just not kind of the passive subjects of, an all-powerful, God. They do not like this. They do not like this at all. And eventually Roger Williams is exiled from Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they do it in probably like the cruelest way they can think of. They wait until it's a really, really harsh winter, and they take him way out into the woods. They take him into Narragansett territory, and they cut him loose. And they're like, good luck, you freaking heretic. We hope you freeze to death or you're killed by the Narragansetts. And then they leave him. And they fully expect Roger Williams to just die in this snow-covered forests. But instead, Roger Williams bumps into the Narragansetts. The Narragansetts are like really salty because, you know, they were completely overshadowed by the Wampanoag now. So the Narragansetts actually bump into Roger Williams. And instead of killing him, which is what the people in Boston wanted, the Narragansetts are like, wait, you're that guy the Puritans hate, right? And Roger Williams goes, well, hate is not Christian. Therefore, I don't hate anyone, and they hate, and that's their sin, but they shouldn't do that. And the Narragansetts don't want to hear it. They're like, well, but they don't like you. And Roger Williams is like, no, they don't like me in Massachusetts Bay. They don't like me in Boston. Are you going to kill me? And the Narragansetts go, nah, we're going to give you a place to live because they don't like you, and that's okay with our book. That's okay in our book. So the Narragansett actually provide a safe haven for Roger Williams. They get him through that winter, and they help him set up his own colony. Now, what about Roger Williams? Roger Williams gets kicked out of Massachusetts Bay for a large number of reasons. He's very critical about the treatment of Indians. He's like, look, Massachusetts Bay is treating these Indians really, really badly. And you cannot treat the Native Americans like this. All right. Native Americans are people. They are the children of God. We should recognize their humanity, and we should proselytize to them and bring them into the faith of the Christian church. And Massachusetts Bay is like, nah, we don't want any of this. If they wanted to be a member of the church, then they would be a member of the elect, and they would feel the pull of God, and they would come to us. So Roger Williams gets kicked out of Massachusetts Bay. He's banished in 1636. He's sent to die in the wilderness. He's embraced by the Narragansetts, and they actually give him a place to live. And he calls this place Providence. He calls it Providence Plantation, and he founds it in 1636. And he says he sets up this little community, he sets up a farm, and he sends out messages to all of Puritan New England. And all of these messages say, hey, look, everyone in New England, if you feel bad, if you're tired of these endless theological debates, if you're sick of being told exactly how to worship, if you've gotten on the wrong side of the local governor or mayor or magistrate or whatever, come to Providence. Providence will have a complete and total freedom of religion. You can worship any way you want, anyhow you want. I am not going to enforce any kind of religious orthodoxy. And this, a lot of people find this really interesting. Again, faith in the Puritan church is actually dropping throughout this whole period, throughout the 1640s, 1650s, 1660s. And people start to show up at Providence. People who are like, I'm tired of being complained at because, you know, I don't want to go to church and hear these three pastors argue. But if I don't go to church, I get fined or whipped. And I'm sick of it. I just want to build my farm and raise cattle, you know, and have a family and go to a church where people aren't arguing all the time. And that's what Roger Williams does. Now, this is like one of the myths of American history, that the Pilgrims came to America seeking to establish a place of religious freedom. That is actually, of course, completely not true. The Puritans came to the New World to build the community of the elect. All right? It is Roger Williams who establishes these traditions of religious freedom. It's Roger Williams who says, we're going to proselytize to the Native Americans. We're going to establish a community that has no orthodoxy. We're going to call this place Rhode Island, and we're going to call our capital Providence. And the rest of Puritan New England totally hates Rhode Island. Oh my God, they hate Rhode Island so much. They're like, what are you doing, Roger Williams? He even lets Baptists show up. He even has a couple Jewish people come up from the Caribbean. Oh my God, Roger Williams, what are you doing down in Rhode Island? But at least it's an illegal settlement and we don't have to worry about it. But Roger Williams kind of does this coup. He actually ends up traveling to England in 1651, ends up talking to the king, and he comes back with a bloody royal charter. He comes back with an official sanction by the king to establish his colony of Rhode Island. He's got a royal charter. And oh, the people in Plymouth are so salty because remember, Plymouth colony landed in the wrong spot. Plymouth does not have a royal charter. They officially have no legal authority to be there at all. So Roger Williams builds Rhode Island. He builds Rhode Island as a refuge of religious freedom. But to the rest of New England, they absolutely hate Rhode Island. They're not Puritans. They're just weirdos and they're dissenters. They start calling Rhode Island the sewer of New England because it's where the drippings and the leachate and the cast-offs and the freaks and the heretics go. They all go to Rhode Island, the sewer of New England. Now, nobody lives forever. Massasoit dies in 1660, and he passes on the rulership of the Wampanoag Nation to his two sons. And his two sons are WAMSUDA and Metacom. And there's drawings of them. That is, I think, supposed to be WAMSUDA on the left, and that is Metacom on the right. Now, both WAMSUDA and Metacom have Christian names. They are officially baptized, even though it's just a purely official ceremony. They're not really Christian. But WAMSUDA is also known as Alexander. And Alexander becomes king of the Wampanoag Nation in 1661. And Alexander is kind of more easygoing. He's older. He's a little bit more relaxed about relations with the Puritans. It is Metacom, his younger brother, who's kind of the angrier of the two brothers, who is more resentful of the English presence and who doesn't see good things happening for the Wampanoag Nation. Now, succeeding William Bradford a few decades later comes his successor, the Puritan of Plymouth Colony, a man named Hosea Winslow. And Hosea Winslow is interesting because Hosea Winslow, if I remember correctly, Hosea Winslow is one of the first governors that is actually born in America. So he's born in 1628. He dies in 1680. And Hosea Winslow is the governor of the Plymouth Colony. And Hosea Winslow is not the man that William Bradford was. William Bradford was calm. William Bradford was understanding. William Bradford treated the Native Americans like equals. Hosea Winslow doesn't do any of this. Hosea Winslow is narrow-minded. He's peevish. He's thin-skinned. He's arrogant. And Hosea Winslow and WAMSUDA are not friends, okay? And because they are not friends, when problems arise, they don't do what William Bradford and Massasoit did, which is sit down, have a meal, smoke a pipe, and work it out. Instead, the problems aren't resolved, and the problems, when you don't fix a problem, it gets worse. And a little problem turns into a bigger problem, which turns into a bigger problem, which turns into a bloody crisis, which will turn into King Philip's War. Problem number one, land use. The Native Americans and the Puritan English have very, very different ideas on how to use land. All right? In fact, they have almost opposite ideas on how to use land. To the Native Americans, you don't really own land, but you have permission to use land, okay? So what you do is you kind of scatter your cornfields throughout the woods and then use the wide-ranging forest around your cornfields to hunt for mostly for deer. Deer being deer and turkey, the main meat sources. You hunt for meat and you raise corn. The English had a very different idea. To the English, you chop up the land into areas. So it looks like that map on the left. You take the land and you slice it up into sections. And this family owns this section, and that family owns this section, and this family owns that section. And ownership of the land is paramount, all right? And that's the land you work on. And nobody else has rights to do anything with the land. But your cattle, on the other hand, your cattle and your sheep, you scatter these herds in something called the commons, which is all the land that nobody owns. So the result is that while the Native Americans would scatter their cornfields through the woods and then go hunt in the forest around their cornfields, the English would clear cut the land, chop it up into distinct farms, and then kind of turn their cattle loose in the woods, all right? So you have like younger boys herding, 20 or 30 head of cattle straight through the Indian forests. And one of the things that cattle do is that the cattle start crowding out native deer populations. So as the cattle population rises, the deer population drops in the forests. And this really annoys the Native Americans because they're like, we need those deer to eat, because if we eat nothing but corn, we're going to have nutritional problems. So they just start hunting cattle, and this causes big problems because the cattle are individually owned. All right. So often these English farmers bitterly complain about the English stealing and eating their cattle, and the Indians are complaining about the cattle driving out the deer. Land use is problem number one. Problem number two is the praying Indians. Okay. I mentioned these guys earlier. You have John Eliot. Okay, John Eliot is an acolyte of Roger Williams. And it is John Eliot who says, I am going to walk into the forests of New England and I will bring the word of God to the Native Americans. And he does this. And he does this in their language. It's really interesting. They translate the Bible into the Massachusetts language. They translate the Bible into Algonquin. And John Eliot walks into the woods. Everyone else in New England thinks he's an idiot. He's just going to get himself killed. But he doesn't. And one of the stranger things is that John Eliot finds an audience among the Native Americans. He starts to baptize the Native Americans. He's living with the Native Americans. He's speaking to them in Algonquin, in Massachusetts. He begins to convert them to Calvinism, to convert them to Anglicanism. And he says, once you're baptized, you get a new name, you get a new identity, and you get to live with other people. But this raises a political and social problem with the praying Indians. So the Native Americans listen to John Eliot, they convert to Calvinism, they convert to Anglicanism, but this creates political and social problems. One, because they have converted, they're not really part of their old Indian nation anymore, but they're not really accepted among the Puritan English. So what happens is that the Native Americans basically the praying Indians kind of have to make their own little societies. And they do that in the map you see right up above my head. In red are the quote unquote praying towns of the Native Americans. They build their own little towns, but in these towns, they build English style houses. They farm the land like Englishmen. They adopt English habits. They speak English. They learn to read and write. Some of them go to Harvard. All right. The praying Indians form their own society, but that conversion is not really acknowledged by the leaders of the Indian nations. WAMSUDA, King Alexander, does not acknowledge that people can actually leave the Wampanoag Nation. And this raises this political question. It's the political question that's right there. What community do the praying Indians actually belong to? Are the praying Indians subject to the rule of the English colonies? Are they part of English society? Or are they just like members of their old Native American nation who just changed religions? All right. And nobody really knows. This creates this kind of legal, social, and political gray area that generates a lot of uncertainty. Problem number 3, land sales. Now, traditionally, what was happening with the Native Americans is that they would hunt deer, they would hunt beaver, and take the deer skins and beaver pelts down to Plymouth or down to Boston and sell them, and then use that money to buy the cool English stuff. Flintlock muskets, knives, axes, wampum, tools, alcohol. But the problem is that beaver populations can get hunted out quite quickly. And as we've seen, the populations of deer are already dropping. So as beaver and deer populations drop, the old ways of making money for the Wampanoag Nation are declining. Nobody really wants to buy their corn because everybody's growing corn. Increasingly, they turn to just basic, simple land sales to raise money. The Wampanoags turn to land sale after land sale after land sale to pay for the English goods that they've come to depend on. Gunpowder, shot, muskets, iron tools, glass beads. All of these things are now part of the Native American tradition. And as they start selling land more and more, the price of land starts to drop because there's more land on the market. And the English of all of these colonies, Plymouth, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, the English are demanding more and more land for lower and lower prices. And they are not above just simply cheating the Native Americans. Saying, okay, and you can look there on the lower left, that's what one of these land deals look like. These things were very informal, written out on a piece of vellum. And often it would say things like, I am buying the land between the sea and the edge of the forest. And they shake hands, they exchange money, and then the Englishman goes and cuts down 40 acres of forest. And he claims that that's the edge of the forest. All right? And the Native Americans are like, that's not fair. And they go to court, and the courts always find for the Englishman. And you can see in the map above this like relentless growth of land being purchased from the Native Americans. So things are tense. Things are tense. Little problems aren't getting resolved, and they're turning into bigger and bigger and bigger problems over time. And in particular, there are 4 events that play a major role in the deterioration of relations between the Puritan colonists and the Native Americans. And number 4 on that list is the Pequod War of 1637. Now, the Pequod War took place back when Massasoit was still king of the Wampanoag. And what the Pequod War was, it was a joint attack with the Wampanoags and their Puritan allies against this really small Native American nation known as the Pequod. Now, the Pequod lived about there. They lived along a stretch of the southern coast of New England, and they had a really evil reputation. They were known to be bandits. They were known to be pirates that would attack canoes and ships traveling along the coast of New England and kill the crews and take the stuff and burn the ship and then claim that everything vanished in a storm. And the Pequod had gotten away with this for decades because they were allies of the much stronger Narragansett nation. Now, Massasoit sees in an attack on the Pequod an ability to humiliate the Narragansetts. If he attacks with overwhelming force, then the Narragansetts either have to fight this lopsided battle to defend the Pequod, or they don't defend the Pequod and come across looking like really unreliable and untrustworthy allies. So this is what Massasoit does. He assembles this army, this overwhelming military force. He gets the English on his side, and the English show up with muskets and a few cannons, and they march south, and they force the issue with the Narragansetts. The Narragansetts opt to not help the Pequod, ruining their reputation. In fact, Massasoit even gets a small group of Narragansetts to join in on the attack. And they attack south. They fight these series of fights through the woods of southern New England. They defeat the Pequod. The Pequod end up retreating inside the fort where they've hidden all of their women and children and old people. And the Pequod have been reduced to a single fort. War's over as far as the Wampanoag are concerned. High fives. High fives all around. The war's over. The Pequod are going to have to give up all of their hunting rights. They've been humiliated. The Narragansett look freaking terrible. Awesome. And then they start to hear the cannons open up. And the Native Americans look absolutely horrified as they watch their Puritan allies load up the cannons and start to shell, firing white-hot shot and musket fire into this fort, which is full of old people, women, and children, full of an enemy that has basically been defeated. And the Native Americans are completely horrified. They're like, look, we've already won the war. We've reduced them to a single fort. What else is there to do? And the Puritans are like, no. Your war ends not when you achieve your goals. Your war ends when you have, annihilated your enemy. Just like the wars of the Old Testament. The Israelites and the Hebrews would fight wars, in ancient Canaan, and would fight the wars until their enemies had been completely wiped out. And the Native Americans are completely horrified. The Pequod fort is set on fire. People are burning to death. Parts of it have collapsed. And as the women and children stream out of the burning Pequod fort, the Native Americans watch in horror as the English draw bead on them and gun them down one at a time. And in fact, Massasoit himself is seen running up and down the Puritan firing line, knocking muskets down, saying, too much, too much, too much. But it doesn't help. The Puritans are singing hymns to Jesus as they begin to massacre women and children who are inside the burning Pequod fort. After all, it was God's will that put them there. It was God's will that put this musket in my hand and put an 11-year-old boy in front of me running. So either he gets back into that fire or... And because they believe in cosmic predestination, they have no guilt about the Pequod massacre. And in the course of a single afternoon, the Puritans smash the Pequod nation for all time. Almost all of the Pequod are killed over the next 3 or 4 hours. As the Narragansetts, as the Wampanoag cry out for the English to stop this massacre of the Pequod, the English do it. English almost break the nation, kill 80-90% of the people. And memory of the Pequod massacre looms large in the imagination of the Native Americans over the next few decades. And people often talk about the atrocity that the English committed on the Pequod. And when King Philip's War starts to get close, this is one of the things that the Native Americans will say. Look, remember what the English did to the poor Pequod. And if we don't attack them first, they're going to do the same thing to us. The English are violent and savage, and we cannot especially trust them. Number 3 on our list is the death of WAMSUDA, King Alexander himself. And he dies in 1662. And he dies in very strange and mysterious circumstances. Now, remember, Plymouth Colony is very insecure about its position in New England. It doesn't have a royal charter. They're very afraid of being swallowed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So led by their governor, Hosea Winslow, that's him right up above me, Hosea Winslow passes this law in Plymouth Colony of very dubious legality. Basically, he says, the Wampanoag, it is illegal for the Wampanoag to sell land to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the reason this law is very dubious is the Wampanoag, neither the Wampanoag nor Massachusetts Bay Colony is bound by any of the laws of Plymouth. All right? It would be like the United States passing a law restricting 2 other completely different countries. It doesn't make any sense. And then there is this rumor that WAMSUDA has sold land to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Hosea Winslow is quite upset. They order WAMSUDA to explain himself in Plymouth. WAMSUDA, being a kind of go along, get along kind of guy, basically shows up at Plymouth. He thinks that they're just going to talk this out the same way that his father and William Bradford used to kind of talk these things out. But he shows up in Plymouth, and Hosea Winslow orders the dude arrested. He orders Alexander to be arrested, chained, and thrown into a cell. And this is not what you do with your good allies. And while WAMSUDA is in the custody of the Plymouth Colony, he dies, okay? And there's like 3 or 4 different stories about the death of WAMSUDA, King Alexander. One story says that he started to get sick, so they let him go, and then he was carried by some of his warriors back to his home, where he died the next day. Another story says that he's in the jail cell when he gets sick, and then he dies in the jail cell. And a third story, the one that's most popular among the Wampanoag and the one that's most popular among the Native Americans, are like, look, they just freaking killed the dude. The Puritans killed him in the jail cell and then just made up this story about how he got sick. But it doesn't matter. And WAMSUDA didn't actually sell land to Massachusetts Bay anyway. King Alexander is dead. WAMSUDA is dead. And the throne, the title of the king of the Wampanoag, passes to his younger brother, Metacom. But Metacom is, again, most often known by his English name. And Metacom becomes King Philip. Number 2 on our list is the murder mystery, the murder of John Sassimon in 1675. Now, John Sassimon was a Wampanoag Indian, so he should have been under the nominal authority of King Philip. But John Sassimon had converted to Christianity. He had learned to speak and read and write English. John Sassimon had become one of those praying Indians. Now, John Sassimon had worked for King Philip for a long time. He'd worked as a translator. But there was some weird falling out between John Sassimon and King Philip. And basically, King Philip threw John Sassimon out of his home and said some very harsh words. And John Sassimon had gone to live in one of the praying towns, and he was visiting Plymouth. And he leaves Plymouth, and then they discover his body. John Sassimon had been murdered He'd been killed, and then his body crammed through a hole in the ice of a lake. So there was an attempt to hide his body. And there was an eyewitness, a very dubious eyewitness, said that he saw 3 Wampanoag Indians murder John Sassimon in an attempt to hide his body. And he identifies the 3 Indians that he saw, and that's their names right up above me. I'm not going to try to pronounce them. And so there's a trial, okay? There's a trial. The 3 Wampanoag Indians are arrested. They are tried for the murder of John Sassimon. And during this trial, King Philip writes a series of letters. And King Philip is really upset at this, okay? King Philip says, wait a minute. How is any of this Plymouth's business? All right? John Sassimon was a Wampanoag Indian. The 3 people accused of killing him are all Wampanoag Indians. Plymouth courts have no jurisdiction in this case. The only person who has jurisdiction in this case is King Philip, all right? And the Plymouth court sends back a message, and they're like, well, how do we know you didn't kill John Sassimon? And King Philip says, I'm king of the Wampanoag. I have the power of life or death over every single member of my nation. If I wanted John Sassimon dead, I would murder him in the middle of Plymouth. And there's nothing you could do about it. I don't care what church he goes to or what language he speaks. John Sassimon is a member of the Wampanoag nation. I can do whatever I want to with him. And you better not do anything with these 3 guys. You've got to give them to me, and I will suss out exactly what happened. I will figure out who killed John Sassimon. It's not what happened. The Plymouth courts find the 3 Wampanoag Indians guilty and execute them. They hang them. King Philip is beyond apoplectic. The war captains of the Wampanoags begin to urge King Philip to go to war. Go to war. Go to war. They just stepped in where they weren't allowed to. We got English cattle all over the place. They steal our land. The English cannot be trusted. Remember what they did with the Pequod. The Pequod were beaten and they murdered them all anyway. English justice cannot be trusted. They cheat and steal too much land. They cheat people with Bibles. They use Bibles to confuse people and lure them away from the Wampanoag nation with Christianity and English. They let the cattle crowd the deer out of the forests. And the Wampanoag war captains remind King Philip, they did kill your brother. They killed your own brother. King Philip, Metacom, is like, things are bad. Things are very, very bad. But I don't want to go to war yet. But I want to prepare. I want to make preparations in case things get worse and we do have to go to war. So Metacom starts to stockpile weapons, specifically guns. He lets it be known that he wants to buy guns, he wants to buy shot, he wants to buy gunpowder, but he's got to raise a lot of money to buy these guns. So to buy these guns, he starts selling off huge tracts of land. So he'll sell off a hill, he'll sell off an area next to a river, he'll sell out this forest over there. So he starts selling all this land, getting the money from that land, and using that money to stockpile guns. All right? And then a rumor starts to circulate in Plymouth. They're like, why is Philip selling all of this land? And somebody points out, maybe he's selling land to Massachusetts Bay. He's selling land to Massachusetts Bay. This is a violation of Plymouth law. We have to do something. And so Hosea Winslow, the governor of Plymouth, makes a demand on June 19th, 1675. He sends a message to King Philip. He sends a message to Metacom. And he says, I have been informed that you have illegally sold land to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. According to Plymouth law, you cannot do this. And so I command you to appear at Plymouth and explain yourself in front of the governor of Plymouth. In other words, the June 19th demand, they demand that he do the exact same thing that WAMSUDA did, his brother, back in 1662. And King Philip can't believe this. King Philip They must think I'm stupid. They're going to do to me the same thing they did to my brother. And the Wampanoag war captains go, they're going to kill you, Philip. They're going to lure you there, and you're going to get sick, and they're going to kill you. And Metacom, King Philip, goes, it is time. It is time to launch King Philip's War. And we'll talk about King Philip's War in the next section, and I will see you there.